Okay. I think we ought to start. It's a very great privilege and a pleasure to welcome Victyor Burgin here to the AA, both for the opening last night of the show, the video Nietzsche's Paris, and also for this evening's lecture, The Time of the Image. The video is in the exhibition room opposite the lecture hall, so I hope for those who weren't able to see it yesterday or today, you'll see it before leaving this evening. The video itself, Nietzsche's Paris, continues Victor's preoccupation with the relationship between physical and psychical space. It draws in this instance on the correspondence between Friedrich Nietzsche, Lou Andreas Salome, and Paul Ray during the 8 months in 1882 when they formed some kind of a trio. The work consists of projected images and sound from a digital video disc and a wall text. Now, in respect to the exhibition, before we start, I would like very much to thank various people who've helped outside the AA in assisting to put the show together. We owe a considerable debt to Sharon Esser for her help in locating an appropriate projector. We'd also very much like to thank Jari Lager for his technical advice and for taking time off from the Listen Gallery to help to install the projector. And above all, we'd like to give our warmest thanks and gratitude to Kathy Batista for dedication and tenacity in seeing this installation through to its exhibition, finally and just. Victor's going to give a talk this evening about his recent work. Victyor Burgin, as you will all know, was born in the UK and now lives in California, where for some time he's been professor in the History of Consciousness department and program at the University of California in Santa Cruz. He's published many books, including In Different Spaces, Place and Memory in the Visual Culture, Some Cities, published by Reaction Press in 1996, The End of Art Theory, Criticism and Postmodernity, published by Macmillan, published between Blackwell and the ICA, and Thinking Photography, published by Macmillan. His photographic and video works, which I'm sure are very well known to you, they've been exhibited worldwide, and they're represented in public collections including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Tate Modern, Victoria and Albert, and the Centre Pompidou. Next year there will be a major retrospective of his work, which will open at Tapia's Foundation in Barcelona next April. For many years, Victor has been strongly missed in London, and it's with great pleasure that we can say he's now been made the Millard Chair in Fine Arts at Goldsmiths. So it's extremely good that he'll be back not only for this week, but back from next year. Victor, welcome.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks. Some of you may have read that this evening was to be a sort of in conversation with Andrew Benjamin. I don't think anyone told Andrew about it. And for reasons entirely beyond his control, he can't be with us this evening. So it's going to be something of an improvisation. I'm not going to give a theory talk. As Mark said, I'm going to talk about some recent work. But I will try to improvise, something which links in with the title that we gave, because it's no accident that one should be thinking about about this topic. I mean, quite a few books have been published about time recently. Now, if I were to go back in time and memory and think about the last time I stood in this position in this room, it was in 1987, and I gave a paper, theory paper then, called Geometry and Abjection, that was subsequently published in 1987 in AA Files. And the paper was written to contest the idea of space as an independently existing, a priori universal, best described according to the principles of Euclidean geometry. And I argued in that paper, historically and psychoanalytically, that the category of space is itself a product of representations and therefore has a history. The representation of space belongs to a general history of representations. And it's also, apart from being historically contingent, it's also subjectively contingent. And in fact, 5 years later, I came across this previously unpublished work note by Freud, made just a short time before his death, that he wrote in 1938, just an isolated work note in which he said, space may be the projection of the extension of the psychical apparatus instead of Kant's a priori determinants of our psychical apparatus. Geometry and Abjection was reprinted as the first chapter of a book I published in 1996 with the University of California Press that Mark mentioned, Indifferent Spaces, Place and Memory in Visual Culture. And that was the first chapter in this book, which looks at issues of space, mainly through psychoanalytic theory. But the long final chapter of that book has the title Brecciated Time. In a long philosophical tradition, derived mainly from Newton, time, comparable to the idea of space in that Euclidean tradition, time is an objective fact. Uninfluenced by objects and events, time, together with space, forms a sort of container in which objects and events simply take place. So this long final chapter reenacts the rhetorical gesture that I made in 1987 with Geometry and Abjection, but this time in relation to time rather than in relation to space. By the way, there's a lot of water gone under the bridge since then. I'm sure that many of the younger ones will think, well, what's so contentious about this notion of space? Certainly there's been a lot of publications since that period, not least Beatrice Colomina's book Sexuality and Space, which came out of a conference that I helped to organize at Princeton in 1990, and I'm sure that many of you here will be familiar with that book from Princeton Architectural Press. But time has had comparatively little attention in relation to the amount of attention that space has received over the last 20 years or so. So again, contesting in this final chapter in Indifferent Spaces, published in 1996, I was sort of contesting this notion of time as a container, much in the way that space used to be thought of as a simply abstract container. And the title is derived from a metaphor, brecciated time. It's derived from a metaphor that Freud was fond of using in relation to the dream. He said that we shouldn't interpret one element of a dream in relation to another element in the same dream, as if somehow the dream were a coherently organized narrative. He said rather the dream is a breccia. A breccia, of course, as I'm sure the architects here will know very well, is a building material composed of fragments of rock held together the binding medium. And Freud was first inspired to use this metaphor looking at the facades of churches in Italy, where on closer inspection a comparatively late facade can be seen to be composed of rocks that have been literally broken off churches from different historical periods and all the way back to classical temples. You'll find bits of classical temple embedded in the facade of a much later church. And Freud said the dream is more like this. So it was a way of saying, well, time is more like this. It's more like a breccia. of differently situated, historically, moments, but all in a sort of present amalgam. And I used as part of the argument, I referred to what little work has been done in psychoanalytic theory on time. There's much more on space, and particularly to the work of Jean Laplanche and his what he describes as his psychoanalytic philosophy of time. He was trained initially as a philosopher before he became an analyst, and he distinguishes between 4 levels, as he puts it, of time. Cosmological time, which is, of course, is the time that physicists are concerned with, and perhaps is closest to that Newtonian abstraction that I referred to earlier. The time of the organism, he said, which we share as human beings with all of the organisms. That's to say, the time of the entropic human body, the time of the body that is born, matures, ages, dies. The time of the human subject, as opposed simply to the human being, and historical time. Now, clearly, Freud's work and all of the work in the psychoanalytic tradition since is concerned really not at all with cosmological time, but comparatively little with the time of the organism, although Freud is concerned with that to a certain extent, particularly in his notes on the mystic writing pad and so on, when he's talking about the perceptual apparatus. But much more closely concerned with the second, with the final pair, time of the human subject and historical time. Now, the time of the human subject, of course, is a time of memory and fantasy. It's a time of the repetition compulsion. It's a time of the after effect, the après coup, as the French put it, something that hits you hard long after the event, something that didn't mean very much at the time, but later, in retrospect, becomes very influential, even traumatic. It's the time of infantile amnesia. It's, many other things. So it's not at all this linear unfolding of one event after another. And of course, historical time. Psychoanalysis, at least in its clinical setting, is all about narration. And certainly since Ricoeur, the work of Paul Ricoeur, history, it's been impossible for historians to think of time as simply, again, one event after another in a chronological, teleological sequence. But history itself is an act of narration. It's a form of writing. Therefore, history becomes, up for grabs. At the age of 87, Ricoeur has just published another book precisely on history and time and memory, which has been much discussed in France at the moment. So that's by way of a sort of general theoretical introduction to a talk that's not going to be particularly theoretical, but simply as a way of saying that in the work that I'm going to be talking about and showing you fragments of, I would say broadly that the forms that I'm trying to elaborate in the work at a formal level, these are concerned with the time of the human subject. They're the forms of repetition. They're the forms of the après-coup, forms of afterwardness, amnesia, fantasy, history. The contents are very much to do with history in the sense of historical events, sort of publicly available and commonly agreed historical events. But as those events are narrated, that's to say, they're about storytelling, and particularly about the relation of storytelling to places, to particular places. And of course, one of those is referred to in the work that's in the other room across there, the Bibliothèque Nationale, in Dominique Perrault's comparatively recent design. I'm going to show extracts from some other of these recent video projection works. Now, in everyday life, the video image is associated mainly with television, the projected image mainly with cinema. The image on a gallery wall is traditionally associated with painting and photography. I think of the space that I work in when I'm making video as a space where the histories of these different practices overlap. I work with the environment of the media images constantly in mind, but I no longer make direct reference to this media environment as I did, for example, in works I made in the 1970s, where advertising imagery would either appear directly cited or it would be evoked in the very forms of text image, rhetorical relations, graphical conventions, and so on. The hybrid and fragmentary forms of the media envelope now enter the work indirectly, for example, in abrupt juxtapositions, precisely of different times. You know, the time of the Bay End, the time of Nietzsche and Salome, for example. Or in the discontinuous spaces of speech, text, and music. The works are designed to loop, and therefore to be entered at any point. The time before the material repeats, on average, is about 12 minutes. I'll show fragments of about 4 minutes from each work. They're clearly not designed to be shown in a setting like this, but again, you can see what sort of space they're actually designed for across there. And again, I'm very concerned with the specificity of that space, which is not television viewing, which is not theatrical viewing, which is not, strictly speaking, a familiar white space gallery setting either. But it has its own specificity. The first work I'll show you a fragment from was commissioned by the Mucharnock Museum in Budapest. And I was asked if I would make a work for the museum that would make a reference to some period of history, Hungarian history, before the Second World War. But psychoanalysis was the first thing I thought of in that setting because it flourished in Hungary until its practitioners were killed or scattered by fascism. Under the post-war communist regime, the practice of psychoanalysis was simply forbidden. Even today, there are very few works in Hungarian by Sándor Ferenczi, one of the earliest and the most brilliant of Freud's collaborators. So I decided in the museum to bring back this period of literally repressed and elided history, to bring that back in this museum setting, but not, of course, as a history of psychoanalysis, but in a form that might engage the interest of the general public who visit museums in the form of a love story. In 1900, this was particularly easy with Ferenczi because he had such a tangled love life. In 1900, 8 years before he first met Freud, Ferenczi had begun an illicit love affair with Gisela Palos, a married woman 8 years his senior. Gisela had 2 daughters. Her younger daughter, Magda, had married Ferenczi's younger brother, Lajos, but her elder daughter, Elma, seemed incapable of forming any lasting relationship. Gisela, her mother, was concerned about this. At her request, in the summer of 1911, Ferenczi took Elma into analysis. Elma was then 24 years old. Ferenczi was 38. In December of 1911, Ferenczi wrote to Freud to confess that he and Elma had fallen in love. Gisela placed her daughter's happiness above her own. In spite of her own distress, she gave her blessing to Elma's marriage to Ferenczi. But Gisela's husband, Geza Palos, voiced mild objections. He said, "Oh, Elma, you've been through this before, and you don't be quite serious." And Elma's indecisive response to her father's reservations unpleasantly surprised Ferenczi. As he wrote to Freud, at this moment she showed not the pure joy of a lover, but rather the pain of her emotional wounds. He said, "The scales fell from my eyes. I had to recognize that the issue here should be one not of marriage, but of the treatment of an illness." Ferenczi suspected that what Elma felt for him was a displacement of her love for her father. He postponed further talk of marriage until analysis could determine whom Elma really loved. We have to remember it's 1911, it's comparatively early days for clinical psychoanalysis. Freud very reluctantly agreed to take over Elmer's psychotherapy, but treated her for only 3 months. Ferenczi then vacillated between Elmer and Gisela as he questioned whether Elmer's love for him was anything other than what he called father transference. Freud confirmed Ferenczi's doubts and strongly advised him against marrying the younger woman. Elmer eventually went to America, where she married a Swedish journalist. At the news of her marriage, Ferenczi fell ill. In 1919, while recovering from his illness, he proposed to Gisela, now divorced. On the morning of the wedding, Elmer's father, Gisela's ex-husband, died of a heart attack. Sándor Ferenczi and Gisela Palos remained married until Ferenczi's death, but Ferenczi never concealed from his wife that his passion for her daughter remained undiminished. In 1921, in a letter to George Grodek, he bitterly blamed Freud for having encouraged him to drive into exile the woman he most loved. Ferenczi coined the term father transference to speak of Elmer's feelings for him. The idea of transference emerged at the very beginning of psychoanalytic theory, but it was easily subsumed under the more general concept of displacement, and its specificity was not brought into focus until the publication of Freud's paper, Observations on Transference Love. Freud's essay was published in 1915, 4 years after Ferenczi had confessed his love for Elmer. Ferenczi had written to Freud, I quote, "I was not able to maintain the cool detachment of the analyst with regard to Elmer." In his essay, Freud observes, I quote, "It is not always easy for the doctor to keep within the limits prescribed by ethics and technique. Those who are still youngish may in particular find it a hard task." In 1915, Freud was on the eve of his 60th birthday. Ferenczi had not long turned 40. From Freud's vantage point, his Hungarian colleague must have appeared still youngish. There can be little doubt that when Freud wrote his paper on transference love, the relationship of Elmer Palos and Sándor Ferenczi must have been prominent amongst his thoughts. In my work for the Muchanok, I restored these two previously disparate items, Freud's dispassionate observations on psychoanalytic technique, a paper that's very well known. It's a classic of Freud's clinical papers, very well known, and long before the really very late publication of the correspondence with Ferenczi. In fact, the most recent and final of the 3 volumes has only just appeared. So I put these two previously quite disparate items, Freud's dispassionate observations on technique, Ferenczi's conflict of emotions and ethical principles, I brought them back into their original proximity. The installation took the form of 3 large projected video images in 3 galleries that connect in a straight line, like the compartments of a railway carriage. There was much coming and going between Budapest and Vienna in the course of the Ferenczi-Gisela-Elmer affair. And what's seen in the video consists mainly of images of the Hungarian landscape shot from the train between Budapest and Vienna. The images are identical in each room, but the sound heard with the images changes as the viewer passes from room to room. The sound heard in the first room is of a voice telling the story of the love triangle from Ferenczi's point of view. The text is based on edited excerpts from his letters to Freud. The sound heard in the final room, the third room, is of a voice speaking a précis of Freud's essay on transference love. But in the middle room, you hear those 2 voices together, and then you realize that they're in conversation. In allusion to the otherwise silent figures of Gisela and Elmer, the words of Freud are spoken by a mature woman, and those of Ferenczi by a young woman. The first sentence on the soundtrack is adapted from Ferenczi's letter to Freud, July the 22nd, 1909. The final sentence is from November the 18th, 1917. The intervening period occupies 739 pages of the published correspondence between Freud and Ferenczi, but takes only a page and a half of my script. In the interest of narrative continuity, I shuffled some written fragments out of their actual historical order, but the sequence of historical events is maintained. Freud's paper on transference love occupies 7 pages of the standard edition, and it too is condensed into a page and a half of soundtrack script. So can I have the first fragment, please?
Be kell vallanom, nem voltam képes megtartani az analitikus hűvös kívülállóságát Frau G. leányával szemben. Nem tudok továbbra is úgy tenni, mintha az, amit Elma iránt érzek, egyszerűen a pszichiáter vagy az atyai barát jóindulata lenne. Frau G. mindenről tud, és egyszerre teszi könnyebbé és nehezebbé helyzetemet páratlanul kedves és szerető hozzáállása.
Az analitikusnak elsőként azt kell felismernie, hogy a beteg szerelme az analízis helyzetéből fakad, és nem személyes vonzerejének tudható be. A kivetített szerelem egyetlen, az adott helyzetből származó, újabb vonást sem tartalmaz, kizárólag korábbi, gyermekkori reakciók ismétléséből áll. Így az analitikusnak semmi oka, hogy hódítására, ahogyan az esetet analízisen kívül nevezhetnénk, büszke legyen, és mindig jó, ha erre emlékezünk.
Házasságom Elmával eldöntöttnek tűnik. Frau G. nagyon szenved. Csak az atyai áldás hiányzik.
Minden bizonnyal óriási sikerélményt szerezne a betegnek, ha szerelme viszonzásra találna. Ez azonban a kezelés teljes kudarcát is jelenteni egyben. Sikerülne felszínre hoznia, a valós életbe megismételni azt, amire csak emlékeznie lett volna szabad. Hasonlóan értelmetlen lenne kivetített nemiségének elnyomására ösztönözni a beteget. Ez annyit jelentene, mintha egy alvilági szellemet sikeresen megigézve visszaküldenénk, anélkül, hogy akár egyetlen kérdést is feltettünk volna. Felszínre hoznánk a tudatalattiba rekesztettet, csak hogy ijedtünkbe újra elnyomhassuk.
Az utolsó percben Elma apja...
In his 1921 book, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, Freud notes that the element of idealization of the object, commonly found in the erotic love of one individual for another, is fundamentally similar to that found in the devotion of the group to the leader and or to the idea or the cause that the leader represents. As a consequence, as Freud writes, everything that the object does and asks for is right and blameless. In the blindness of love, remorselessness is carried to the pitch of crime. Sándor Ferenczi died in 1933, the year that Adolf Hitler was appointed Germany's Chancellor. After the German annexation of Austria in March 1938, the Princess Marie Bonaparte travelled to Vienna to add her own voice to those trying to persuade Freud to leave. As on previous occasions, she took along a small movie camera to record her visit to the Freud household. On this trip, exceptionally, she took the camera into the street. She titled the resulting short sequence Le 1er mai à Vienne après l'Anschluss. On this day, Hitler paraded through Vienna to receive the adulation of the crowd. The parade itself is not seen in Bonaparte's film. Her camera pans across the facade of Berggasse 19, the building where Freud had lived and practiced for 47 years, now draped with swastika banners. It frames the massed crowds cheering Hitler. All the shots are taken at a distance from or behind their subjects. except for one. At the very end of the sequence, the camera momentarily dwells in full frontal close-up on the isolated figure of a well-dressed young woman. For about 4 seconds, she hesitates, surprised before the camera. Then she's gone. It's that image that appears digitally reworked into longer sequences and punctuates the images shot from the train. The fragment of opera is from Strauss's Der Rosenkavalier, not the waltz Strauss, the other Strauss. Ferenczi was an opera buff. He was always trying to take Freud to the opera, and Freud steadfastly refused to go. And Budapest has a really wonderful opera house, and I shot a lot of video in the opera house, hoping to include it, but finally decided that the red had to stand in metonymically for that. And the choice of the opera, which Ferenczi may very well have seen, was determined by the fact that it's really the story of an older woman who gives up her younger lover for a younger woman. That's a rather ambivalent way of putting it, and maybe it suits the ambivalence of the sexual, sort of sexuality of the opera. The next fragment I'm going to show is from a work that was commissioned by the Weimar 99 Cultural Festival. It took place last year, 1999, of course, in Weimar. Weimar figures prominently in German cultural and political history. It has been home to the Kranachs, to Goethe, Schiller, and Nietzsche, to Bach and to Liszt. After the First World War, the city became the seat of government of the Democratic Republic. During this period, as again many of you know very well, the Bauhaus School of Design was founded there, whose faculty included Gropius, Moholy-Nagy, Mies van der Rohe, Breuer, and so on. In 1933, the Nazis closed the Bauhaus, which by then had moved to Dessau. And in 1937, they opened the Buchenwald concentration camp in the Ettersberg forest that borders Weimar. It was in this forest, at the Schloss Ettersberg, that Goethe presided over the Court of the Muses that first established Weimar's reputation as a cultural capital. Goethe became a ducal administrator for the Duchy of Saxe-Weimar in 1775, and his association with Weimar continued until his death there in 1832. In Goethe's day, a hunting star was maintained in the forest. Animals would be flushed out and driven down paths cut through the woods in the form of a star. Members of the leisure class would lie in ambush where the paths intersected, and whatever came by, animal, peasant, would be shot. By the time the National Socialists arrived at the forest, the castle had fallen into disrepair. The hunting star had become overgrown, except in places at the edge of the forest where local people would come to cut wood. Without the builders of Buchenwald being aware of its history, one of these paths came to form the principal axis of the concentration camp. When the renovation of the Schloss Ettersberg began in preparation for the Weimar 99 festival, the architect commissioned to undertake the work inaugurated a simple and effective act of remembrance. He ordered the clearing of the long-concealed hunting path that connects the site of Goethe's Court of the Muses to the site of the Buchenwald concentration camp. Visitors to Weimar are now able to walk from one place to the other. The walk is physically arduous. No less difficult is the task of covering the emotional and intellectual ground between the two sites. Now, I was invited by the architect to make a video to be installed in a room in the Schloss Ettersberg, which would provide visitors with an occasion for reflection on the walk. As part of my research for the work, I read a number of books by Goethe, including his novel of 1809, Elective Affinities. The book is an account of the effects on a hitherto stable relationship between a married couple of the landowning class, Edward and Charlotte, when two others are introduced into their household. Edward prevails upon his wife to allow an old friend of his, the captain, to live with them, and Charlotte responds by bringing her young niece, Ottilia, to live at the house. The book, as one commentator put it, is a study of the geometry of changing relationships, of the shifting attractions and separations amongst four people. And it's also an account of the disasters that ensue from the will to plan and control totally. One of the reasons Edvard gives for introducing the captain into the household is that his friend is a skilled surveyor and engineer, and therefore able to help the couple with improvements to their estate. The first task the captain undertakes is to draw an accurate map of the lands owned by his hosts. This map is used for the first time when the four get together following a walk around the grounds to plan the building of a pavilion away from the house. And I quote from the book. At home that evening they straightway took out the new map. "I would build a pavilion here," said Ottilia, laying her finger on the highest level place on the hill. "You could not see the mansion, I know, for it is concealed by the wood, but you would find yourself in a new and different world." It's this passage in the original German that's heard as voiceover on the soundtrack of the video. The passage was stenciled, translated into several languages, on the wall of the light trap outside the room where the projection took place, and the attribution given. When I first visited Schloss Ettersberg and the park around it, I was struck by an uncanny sense of familiarity. I then realized that I was inhabiting the same topography that Goethe describes in Elective Affinities. Goethe's characters planned a utopian construction on the hill above Schloss Ettersberg. What will be built in reality over a century later will be the new and different world of Buchenwald. Have the next fragment, please.
Man nahm abends zu Hause sogleich die neue Karte vor. Ich würde, sagte Ottilie, indem sie den Finger auf die höchste Fläche der Anhöhe setzte, das Haus hierher bauen. Man sähe zwar das Schloss nicht, denn es wird von dem Wäldchen bedeckt, aber man befände sich auch dafür wie in einer andern und neuen Welt.
stop the video there.
Is that on or off?
Off. Another case history, one of a number of works I've made based on Hitchcock's film Vertigo. The film is an adaptation of the novel D'Entre les Morts by two French crime writers, Pierre Boileau and Thomas Nassajac. And their novel, in turn, is derived from the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. I'm not concerned in the video to present those stories in their entirety. I'm rather interested in the subordinate narratives that make up the story. Stories told in a fragmentary, laconic, and repetitive form, similar to those, for example, of daydreams. The image track of this particular fragment is suggested by Madeleine's identification with Carlotta and the detective's pursuit of Madeleine. I'm not going to say too much about the story of Vertigo because I'm assuming that most of you will be familiar with it. The images again include shots taken at locations that you see in Vertigo, the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco, and Big Basin Redwoods. The intertitles that you'll see refer to the scene of rescue from water. I mean, the way I break down these narratives in order to work with them can be summed up as follows. This video is really based upon this little scenario. That Madeleine is haunted by her forebear, Carlotta. Carlotta drowned herself after her lover abandoned her. That Madeleine is now the same age Carlotta was when she died, and is obsessed by thoughts of her own death. Arranging her hair in the style worn by Carlotta, she wanders through the city. The detective follows her. Madeleine throws herself into the water and is rescued by the detective. So that gives a sort of event list of scenes with duration, but no development. And the two scenes I've chosen are Madeleine is looking at Carlotta, the detective is looking at Madeleine. That's one sort of composite scene, and the other item is the rescue from water, which again is represented twice over, but with different intertitle sequences. And this work is made up of fragments. It's a breccia of previous works of mine that I've broken up and included to make this new work. If it were an opera, it would have been called a pasticcio. That was the practice of doing that. Well, I'll just play it because I think it's fairly self-evident. Can the next introduce? Maybe if the man in the second row could sort of slide down into his seat a little bit. Thanks. Thanks. Stop it there. The images often may appear to be stills, and they're not. It's simply that the model is standing very still, but the frames are rattling by at 29.97 frames per second, which is the NTSC signal rate. Again, it's this idea of thinking what the specificity of an image on a gallery wall might be. That it's composed of video, but it's not television. It's projected, but it's not the cinema. It's a large image on a gallery wall, but it's not a painting. You know, how do you deal with the specificity of that image? What constitutes the specific time, in the sense of duration, for example, of that image? The music is Haydn, Orfeo ed Euridice. The final work I'll show a fragment from is the one showing across there. The year 2000 is the centenary of the death in Weimar of Friedrich Nietzsche. 3 years after his death, Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche, his sister, established the Nietzsche archive in the house in which he died. She commissioned the Belgian architect, Henry van der Velde, to reconstruct the entrance and ground floor reception rooms, and the archive is now as much a place of pilgrimage for admirers of van der Velde's Art Nouveau design as it is for students of Nietzsche's philosophy. After I'd completed work on my video for the Schloss Ettersburg, it was suggested that I might be interested in producing a work in relation to the Nietzsche centenary. After Nietzsche's death, his sister worked tirelessly to ensure that his work was appropriated by the fascists. This can only be done by heavily editing Nietzsche. He despised nationalism. He said he was a bad German, but a very good European. He was contemptuous of German culture to the point of denying that there was any such thing. He said on numerous occasions that Europe would be nowhere without the Jews, and spoke out vehemently against the anti-Semitism that his sister had embraced. Nevertheless, the sister's version of Nietzsche has prevailed. In the post-war years, the communist administration of Weimar placed a pall of disapprobation over Nietzsche that has not yet fully lifted. And the proposal that I should do a work on Nietzsche for Weimar never materialized. But it did lead me to reopen long neglected Nietzsche works on my shelves and to start to read about his life. And while I was doing that work, during the summer, I was asked very kindly by the Architectural Association to propose a work for the gallery space there. I was living in Paris at the time, so I was suddenly presented with a very particular conjunction of terms: Nietzsche, architecture, Paris. And again, being interested in psychoanalysis, I let the first things that come to mind speak, as it were, and try to find out what, if anything, they could have in common. So the resulting video is an attempt to bring those very disparate, heterogeneous terms, that breccia of items, together in a single space. Nietzsche never visited Paris. The more I read during that summer, the stranger this seemed. He was familiar with many European cities. He was a great wanderer through European cities. He was either ill or believed himself to be ill to the point that he was ill. And he considered that he had to have a constant climate, otherwise he would get worse, and so he would migrate like a nomad from one European city to another according to changes in the seasons. He was especially enthusiastic in his admiration for French culture, and French was the only language he knew well apart from his own. So Paris must certainly have occupied a very special place in his imagination. So when I started to read more about him, I started to wonder why he never went to Paris. And then I came across what I believe must be the reason. In his correspondence with Paul Ray, his friend, the philosopher Paul Ray, and Lou von Salome, who later was to become Lou Andreas Salome. She married this man called Fred Andreas, And as Lou Andreas Salome, she became famous as a close associate of Freud's, one of the first women analysts. But when she met Nietzsche, she was 20 years old. She was Lou von Salome, and she was devastating. Freud wrote to Ferenczi much later in her life. She wanted to visit Ferenczi in Budapest, and asked if Freud would like to write a letter of introduction. So Freud wrote to Ferenczi saying, I'd like to introduce our colleague, Lou Andreas Salome, and went on about her brilliance and the contributions that she was making to their new science. And he said, so I strongly advise you to meet her. But, he said, be advised, many tracks lead into her den, none lead out. Well, in April of 1882, while in Rome, Nietzsche met and apparently fell in love with Lou Salome. During that same spring, Nietzsche, Salome, and their mutual friend, Paul Ray, made plans to set up an intellectual ménage à trois. The idea of living together came from Salome and originally concerned only herself and Ray, which according to him was scandalous at the time that a woman should propose such an arrangement. And in fact, Nietzsche's sister tried to get Salome deported by the police for immorality, for coming up with that idea. Have her sent back to Russia, which is where she came from. Nietzsche suggested they should live in Paris, and he set about contacting friends there to help find a suitable apartment. The three were still discussing their Paris plans when they met again in Leipzig in November. Then quite abruptly, Salome and Ray left the city without warning anyone or leaving any indication of where they'd gone. The abandoned Nietzsche assumed incorrectly that they were in Paris. Though it ended in bitter estrangement, the short-lived relationship between Nietzsche and Salome had passed through an idyllic space of intimacy during the 3 weeks in August that they spent together debating philosophy in the forest of Tautenberg. The historical association between forests, gardens, and learning is exploited by Dominique Perrault in the recently completed, or comparatively recently completed, Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the François Mitterrand building. His sunken forest garden at the centre of the site has been appropriately described by one commentator, in fact a commentator who works in this very building, as, I quote, an untouchable Eden from which researchers and members of the public are barred. That's Barbara Ann Campbell in Paris, A Guide to Recent Architecture. It's a great little book that I would recommend to anybody going to Paris. In memory of Nietzsche's Edenic period with the unattainable Lou, it's this Paris site that appears in the work. Lou Salome said that the idea of living together with Ray had come to her in a dream. Actually, this is Lou Andreas Salome who's speaking, because it's later on in her memoirs. She says that this idea came to her in a dream, and she writes, I saw a pleasant study filled with books and flowers between 2 bedrooms, and coming and going amongst us, comrades in thought, forming an intellectual circle, at once serious and light-hearted. This sentence is spoken on the soundtrack in the original German, and part of it appears in translation as a title sequence. Have the fragment, please. Thanks. End of fragment.
Okay, we have a little time left over for Victor to take questions.
I also appreciate that many of you have places to go, and I won't feel hurt if you rush out. Yes. Want some water?
I was interested in the relationship between. Hello again. Can you? I was interested in the relationship between music and image in the works that you're constructing. And particularly, I wondered if does the music provide conjunction, a temporal conjunction between images, or is it distracted from the images? Is it the second element that's working alongside them? And that also linked to the second question, which was with the historical elements that you were using, such as costume or the quotations and the classical music references and so on, what's their temporal relationship to the works? Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. I suppose what I'm trying to do, and what attracted me to this is a rather long way around of answering your question, but what attracted me to digital video, that's to say, video that is edited on a computer, is it's the closest I can get to trying to model outside the processes of my own mind, my own consciousness and apprehension. And I refer to an interest in the media environment, and I've always been interested in that. I've always written about it, and it's always been there in my work. And I said earlier that it's not there as a direct citation anymore, but it's there in the very structure of the work. So those disjunctions, they're very much part of that experience of the everyday environment of images, where you're constantly getting just fragments and flashes of things. I mean, this is not a revolutionary idea. I mean, lots of people use it in all sorts of ways. But I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to sort of model that mental space-time, which is Breccia, and in which, for example, there's a deliberate self-conscious reversal of the convention of showing the contemporaneity in a colour photograph and the 19th century in a black and white photograph. I know that you also get costume drama films, which are always coloured, but there's that deliberate reversal, and then there's that very abrupt collision of two totally separate times in the images of the site, and then that citation of a different historical moment through costume. So I don't know whether that's really an answer to the question. The selection of the music, it's all from the Baroque period, which is a period I'm particularly interested in at the moment. There's to use a metaphor, and it's very banal, but I think it's very true. There's an architectural quality about that music that seemed to me very, particularly suitable to looking at that site. So there's something in the very quality and the spaciness, the spacing, the regularity of the music and the regularity of that architecture. So that was one reason for using it there. But of course, having said that, there are many fragments of Baroque music would suit that that image. Why these? And I was always, inspired by Eisenstein's criticism of Vertov, who he accused of unmotivated camera mischief. And I thought, okay, there's going to be no unmotivated mischief in my work. Everything's going to be motivated. So there's always a foundation that I build upon, which is important for me in building the work. But like an architectural foundation, it's not something that you expect the visitor to see, but it's there. So which operas? Well, two operas which are about love triangles. Well, trying to think of an opera which isn't actually, it's quite difficult, but two fragments of Handel, Alcina and Ariodante, which both contain these love triangles and these scenes of jealousy and betrayal and so on. And just for the ineffable grain of the voice, and just for that which cannot be described thereof, as Wittgenstein said, do not speak. But again, I'm interested in, as I say, trying to construct a specificity in that dark cube at a gallery, out of the fragments, a sort of breccia, of what exists already. The history of video, the history of the movies, and so on, which includes intertitles. But of course, I guess you did have the piano often rattling away over the intertitles. So there is that tradition there. But actually marrying, spending quite a lot of time editing the breathing of the black and white of the titles to the breathing of the music, in a way that perhaps wasn't dwelt upon in the past. So working in those interstices between existing practices to try to grow something that moves into a different space. Thanks.
I was wondering, you talked about mapping or exhibiting, manifesting in a mental space. I was wondering whose mental space it is, because I was struck by the incredible kind of stillness and calmness of the imagery, and yet all the stories you told that triggered them. These people coming and going, and these must have been for them incredibly hectic crying.
Yes, yeah.
Whose mental space? Is it your reflections on this hectic?
Two things. When I say mental space, one way of thinking of that is structurally. So again, from an interest in psychoanalytic theory, linguistics, you can get some idea of the structuring or the structuration of representations in psychological processes. But to give an example of what I mean by that, what Freud called condensation. In a dream, you might have a dream, and you might say to a friend, before they look totally bored, you start to tell them your dream, but you say, there's this figure in a dream last night I met, and I don't know whether it was my mother or my sister, because it looked like my mother, but she sounded like my sister. Well, in the real world, you have to apply the law of excluded middle and say, well, is it your mother or your sister? It can't be the same person. Two different people in the same space. In a dream, it can. That's a condensation. So that's what I mean by the structuration. These kinds of structures, I think, are a common mental space. That's the very space in which thought takes place, as it were. Those are the thought processes that we all share. Now, beyond that, of course, there is the emotional space and the feelings of the characters, the actual historically existing characters, where one can quite well guess at what their feelings might have been, because generally in these sorts of situations, although we talk about Nietzsche and famous people, in fact, they're very banal sorts of emotional situations that almost everybody by the time they reach a certain age has been through, very familiar. The disjunction between what you might think of as the turmoil of those emotional spaces and what you described as the relative calm of the videos is again a deliberate rhetorical device. It's a good old rhetorical distanciation, Brechtian distanciation strategy. Taking something and sort of reversing it into the opposite and presenting something very hot in very cool terms. Or again, one could reverse that rhetoric and present something very cool, but present it in very hot terms with lots of fast cutting in sort of MTV sort of way. Although again, I'm trying to, as I say, construct a specificity that doesn't simply match the media, but works in the interstices.
I wonder whether you could say a bit more about your choice of the Bibliothèque de France as a site for your film, which is in the exhibition room, and because what you have mentioned so far is the existence of the forest as a core of the building, but clearly there is a lot more to the building, and there is notably its size. When I looked at the exhibition this afternoon, the forest aspect registered but it was somewhat irresistible to also make a connection, which is probably wrong, but between, say, Nietzsche and, say, the Superman. And I wondered what have been your thoughts about the choice of site, and whether you have also considered possibly other Parisian sites where you might find both books and plans.
Well, that presented itself to me. You know, it was there, and it clicked. And again, it's a consequence of modelling one's working procedures on psychoanalytic models, where, for example, you know, the first rule of psychoanalysis is say the first thing that comes to mind, which, you know, sounds easy enough, but it's not. If in ordinary social life you said the first thing that came to mind, you know, blood would be running in the gutters, buildings would be in flames. So it's not something we normally do, but that's the first rule of a psychoanalysis. Say the first thing that comes to mind. Don't censor it. Don't say, well, that's stupid, that's trivial, that's disgusting. It came to mind. If it came to mind, it's significant. So it came to mind, what does it mean to me? And I think both in writing and certainly in making videos, I find, I'm sure a lot of people find, and I'm sure you've all had this experience, that when you start working, you don't really know what it is that you're doing. You have these materials, and these materials present themselves to you as somehow more, you know, whatever you want to say, significant, interesting. They impose themselves on you more than other materials, and you just go with that. And then working is a process of trying to find out what it is that, you know, that they mean, and that's often quite different from what you'd hoped to find. And in fact, very often it's in the gap between what you hoped for and what you get. It's in the disappointment of the work at the end that you then go on to make a new work, a different work, to try to get it right next time. So I think, you know, very often it's almost like the reverse of the analysis of a dream, because in the analysis of a dream you have something which is coherent, that you then break up, you fragment. You know, Freud says, don't think of the dream as a story, as a narrative. Think of it as a rebus, a picture puzzle. It has to be broken apart, element by element. So the dream is there to be broken up, whereas the fragments that are presented to one as the fragments of one's work, of one's research, whether it's in writing or in drawing for architecture or in making videos or, you know, whatever project it is, or cooking, it goes in the opposite direction. You begin with the fragments, and then you try to make it coherent, you try to make it plausible, and what makes it hang together is precisely the form. So you try to make a formal entity that's plausible, that will then spuriously convince the viewer that there is something here. And I think that what is there is precisely a machinery that will allow them to associate in the way that you associated. So there's an absence. There isn't, you know, because you or someone else said, I don't know whether this is right, as if, you know, the author held the key of the meaning of the work. Whereas I think there's an absence in the center of the work, which is the author's unconscious, the author's unknown desire, that which the author does not know, but which can be the generative point for associations that others will make to it. So that their reading of the work then becomes a text that's generated out of the text of the work, which itself is nothing other than the product of previous textuality. You know, Nietzsche's life, Perrault's building, the history of modernism, and so on. So an endless process of textuality in the old, you know, Barthesian sense, or you know, dissemination in the Derridean sense, if you want to be theoretical about it. Again, to be a bit more concrete, why that site? Because of the enormous contrast between the sort of modernist rationalism of that building and the irrationalism and the emotion of the story, which might then allow one to reflect upon the irrationalism of the building. You know, those books in glass towers, and those gardens you can't get into, and the trees imported from far away to make this wonderful forest garden that are dying because they don't like it in Paris. All of this frantic stripping of the rainforest to make all that decking. You know, there must be like at least half of Amazon there. And then all of these tourists, you know, I mean, the whole thing is so perfectly drawn and rational. And then busloads of tourists turn up, and they're dumped there, and then they just wander, lost, completely lost. So I wanted some of that conflict between this dream of precision and order on the one hand, and the way that comes undone and that comes unraveled in real life, which is as messy as that surrounding tangle of railway tracks and new cranes and everything else that litters the background of Perra's building.
We've got time for one more. Gustav.
You started working with photography and now you turn towards the video. Could you please say something about the difference between photography and video and perhaps how you now evaluate this, these two?
Yeah, in fact, that preoccupies me when I'm working. That's really interesting to me, and I actually don't distinguish between photography and video. So I just give a practical example because some people have asked me already, and I've answered it. So excuse me if I say this again. But some people have said, "How did you make that pan?" The black and white pans. There's the site is a rectangle, a long rectangle, and there's a pan from the midpoint of each side of the site. I used a video camera. I used the one that we've been using to play the tape from. I mounted it on a still photography panoramic head. This is just a panoramic head for mounting a still camera, where it has click stops, so you can go click, shot, and get regular increments all the way around a 360-degree turn. And then when you have all of those stills, you then put them together to make a panoramic image. So I put a video camera, I took 2 seconds of video at each point, and then about 36 images. And then I took 1 frame from that 2 seconds of video, and then I stitched those frames together using a computer to make a long panoramic image. Then I took the color out of it, and then I took all the people, all the tourists out of it, which is a great pleasure. And then I reanimated it in software. So what you get is what looks to be a very familiar camera movement, a pan, which in fact is a traveling shot, but it's a virtual traveling shot. And moreover, it's completely impossible, either as a traveling shot or as a pan, because there's no parallax. If it were a normal pan, you would get objects in the foreground moving differentially against objects in the background, whereas here those relationships remain totally fixed. And I think that because of that, because of those various elements, what I'm hoping for is that it will look familiar, and at the same time there will be something slightly uncanny about it. And that's what I'm working on increasingly. I've been using a new digital panoramic camera that gives very large files, 300 megabyte files, very, very high resolution, higher than film. And it's controlled from a computer, from a PowerBook computer, and the image is fed directly into the computer. And now I can do what I can't do with here. I can actually move into the image because there's so much resolution that I can start to move in this virtual space and make virtual camera movements inside photographs. So it's precisely that area between photography, between the still and between the movie that I'm interested in. And again, the computer allows you to explore that space. But I'm not trying to do it, like make virtual reality that announces itself as such, with this, we all know the imagery, but to present something that looks familiar, which is totally impossible. I'm working at the moment on files that I shot at the Mies van der Rohe Pavilion in Barcelona, and the very high resolution files. And again, in order to move from one pan to another, I'm moving through Kolbe's statue, Dawn, that's in one corner. And in order to move smoothly from one pan to another, I needed that statue to be the same in both shots. So from 2 completely different angles, the statue is seen as the same. It's completely plausible. You wouldn't notice there was anything unusual about it, but it's a totally impossible perspective. So again, I'm interested in that sort of perspective that only a digital treatment can give you.
Okay, I think we're going to have to end there. And on your behalf, I'd like to thank Victor very much, and we look forward to seeing you when you move back to London. Thank you.
Thank you. you forgot to announce.
No, it's on the same.
Oh, good.